I still remember the day Grandma Tessa took me to Washington, D.C. We saw so many famous statues and places, and then when we got to one place, Grandma stopped and just stared. I didn't understand why, but it looked like she was going to cry. Elizabeth, here's where the government made a decision that changed your grandma's life and yours forever. I'm sure I asked her what she meant, but it would be many years before I really understood that she was talking about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the most important court in the country. The Supreme Court is made up of a group of 9 people who know a lot about our national laws and the Constitution. These 9 people are called justices, which means they are people who make fair decisions. Our laws and Constitution are the rules that everyone in our country must follow. When there is a question about the Constitution or a national law, the Supreme Court justices decide what they mean. Supreme Court justices have their jobs for life. This guarantees that they can make tough decisions without worrying about losing their jobs. Most Supreme Court justices begin their careers as lawyers. After practicing law, they become judges. All Supreme Court justices get their jobs the same way. The President chooses them.
I am proud to nominate this path-breaking attorney, advocate, and judge to be the 107th Justice to the United States Supreme Court.
But before a judge can become a Supreme Court justice, the Senate must approve the President's choice. The lead justice on the Supreme Court is called the Chief Justice. A court is the place where fair decisions are made. The Supreme Court is in a large building in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The 9 justices work in the Supreme Court building. That's where they make their decisions. The Supreme Court is similar to most state Supreme Courts, but different from trial courts. A trial court is what most people think of when they hear the word court. Most city and county courts and the lower state and federal courts are trial courts. These courts have just one justice or judge, and they usually have a jury. The Supreme Court does not have a jury. A jury is a group of people chosen to listen to both sides in a court case and decide which side is right. In some cases, the jury must decide whether or not a person has committed a crime. These are called criminal cases. A judge's job in a trial court is to make sure that both sides argue fairly and to help explain the law to the jury. In cases where there is no jury, the judge decides the case. Because the Supreme Court is the highest court in our country, it is important that a committee of people make the decisions of the court. A majority of justices have to agree for a decision to be reached by the Supreme Court. Cases that are heard by the Supreme Court are about laws that affect the whole country, not just a city, county, or state. When the founders of our country created the 3 branches of our national government, they made the Supreme Court the head of the judicial branch. The judicial branch was created to explain or interpret the Constitution and decide the fairness of national laws. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the judicial branch. Other courts, called federal or national courts, hear cases between people from different states, two or more states, people or states and the United States, and the United States and other countries. There are 3 levels of federal courts in the judicial branch. The first level is the district court. That's where almost every federal or national case starts out. This is the only federal court that has a jury. It is a trial court. When the district court makes a decision, the party who loses a case can ask a higher court to change the decision. The case then moves up to the next level, the Court of Appeals. Appeal means to ask a more powerful court to change a decision. The Court of Appeals is more powerful than the district court. If one party again doesn't like the Court of Appeals decision, they can take it to the Supreme Court, the highest court in our country. The Supreme Court makes the final decision. The Supreme Court gets its cases from other federal courts. These are the cases that are being appealed. The justices get thousands of cases each year, but they accept less than 100 of these. Once a case comes into the Supreme Court, it is given to all 9 justices. Each justice reads about the case and decides if it is important enough to be reviewed. The justices usually look for cases that affect the Constitution or national issues. If 4 of the justices believe they should review a case, then it becomes a Supreme Court case. That means that both sides in the case will be allowed to tell their side of the story to the 9 justices. When a case is tried in front of the Supreme Court, both sides meet in a large courtroom in the Supreme Court building. The 9 justices sit at a long raised bench, and the lawyers for each side stand in front of them and try to convince the justices that their side is right. Usually, each lawyer has 30 minutes to plead their case. If it is a really important case, they'll have more time. After the 2 lawyers are done talking, the justices meet in a conference room to discuss the case. Once they have all talked about the case, they take a vote to decide which side they think is right.
The approach that I like to take is to have an answer for each case before I come in and have that in an outline form, so I know how I'm going to decide the case.
The majority of the justices must agree for there to be a decision. Both parties must accept the decision of the Supreme Court because there is no higher court that they can appeal to. There have been many cases that have made their way up the courts of the judicial branch, all the way to the Supreme Court. Some of the decisions the Supreme Court has made have changed the lives of many Americans. Before the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, white children and African American children in some parts of our country could not attend the same school. This important Supreme Court case made it illegal to separate or segregate students. Now, children of all colors and races can attend public schools together. That decision changed my grandma's life. She was able to go to a better school, and she was the first person in our family to go on and graduate from college. If you've ever watched a police show on TV, you've probably heard officers reading the Miranda warning to people, telling them their rights. Before the 1966 Supreme Court case of Miranda versus Arizona, when a person was arrested, they might not have known that they had certain rights, and they might feel pressured to talk to the police without the advice of a lawyer. In the year 2000, the Supreme Court made a decision that affected who would be president. Al Gore and George W. Bush disagreed over the way the presidential election was run in certain parts of the country. They took their case to the Supreme Court. The court decided in favor of George W. Bush, and he became the 43rd president. Besides reviewing cases, the Supreme Court has other responsibilities. These responsibilities include keeping checks on the executive and the legislative branches of our federal government. There are many ways that all three branches of government watch over each other. These checks on each other keep the federal government in balance so that no one branch can become too strong. The Supreme Court checks the executive branch. They review presidential treaties to make sure they follow the Constitution. A treaty is a written agreement between two or more countries that describes how the countries should treat each other. The Supreme Court also reviews executive orders. These are written orders of the president. The orders describe how the president wants the government to do its work. The Supreme Court provides checks to the legislative branch of our federal government. The justices review some of the laws that Congress makes, but only when these laws are part of a Supreme Court case. When the Supreme Court reviews a law made by Congress, they are making sure that the law follows the rules of the Constitution. In turn, the legislative branch checks the judicial branch. Congress watches what the justices of the Supreme Court do. Congress has the power to impeach the justices. Impeach means to remove them from their job. However, a justice is only impeached if he or she commits a crime against the country. The executive branch checks the judicial branch by appointing justices to the Supreme Court. And the legislative branch has a check on both the executive and judicial branches by approving or not approving their appointments.
That I'll be offering tomorrow.
The purpose of the Constitution is to support the common good of our nation and to protect everyone's rights. It was also created to separate and limit the powers of government so that our basic freedoms are not violated. The judicial branch, with its checks on the other branches, helps to keep a balance of power in our government. These checks ensure that no one of the three branches becomes too powerful. Whenever there is a case with a question about the Constitution or a national law, the Supreme Court justices will decide what the law means. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. When they make a decision, it is final. The 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court have the job of understanding and protecting the Constitution. They are the judicial leaders who we trust to protect our rights, and we depend on them to ensure that everyone is treated equally under the law. I still remember the day Grandma Tessa took me to Washington, D.C. My grandma, and me.